So intervention strategies. Now we've gone through the targets. Now you want some take-home stuff here in the last 45 minutes of what are some things that I can do in my work with this population. The first thing about assessment always is, what are you trying to get to? Are you assessing for risk? Are you assessing to help the person develop a treatment plan? Or are you assessing because you're in the transition, on a transition team and trying to come up with supervision planning ideas? So that's critical because that's going to determine some of what you're looking at. I think the other thing when you're talking about assessment with sex offenders, it's important to remember, and I've done this in assessment trainings and trainings with folks who are more, the purpose of the training was more direct services, is I'll ask them to pair up and I'll have them talk to each other for a period of time before the workshop about the last conversation they had with a significant other related to their sexual behavior. And I want you to talk together, and I want you to talk about what you've come as far as the status of your sexual interactions and what you've come up with solutions to improve your sexual behavior. And of course, they look at me like, what are you, some kind of pervert or something, why are you asking me to do that? And of course, some start doing it right away and you can do it all day. But a lot of folks are really awkward or uncomfortable about it. And what we'll do as part of that then is I'll ask them, what was uncomfortable about this? What could have made it more comfortable? The reason for that is when we deal with offenders who committed sexual crimes, why would you assume that they're going to easily be able to talk about those things when you yourself, who haven't necessarily engaged in criminal sexual behavior, have difficulty talking about it? And so a lot of the things that would make you more comfortable, knowing why are we talking about it, confidentiality, how you're going to use the material, those kinds of things, those are things that they also would like to know, and it's important for them to be able to know as well. Okay? It's amazing to me sometimes, we take a group of folks who we know have attachment difficulties, interpersonal difficulties, and expression difficulties, and then when we see it in our session, we attribute it to antisocial personality and kind of wrap it into them not wanting to cooperate with the process. I think you want to be careful about that. Yes?
When you have sexual offenders who are married, is there a treatment for the spouses? Or do they go through treatment together? Or is it a couples therapy?
I mean, there's certainly the multimodal piece that I said before. You want to take into consideration anything from a person who's married and now has to address the issue, whether their spouse was, this was the children they had together, whether it was he's out committing aggressive rapes or other kinds of sex offenses outside of the home. There's a lot of different things that can be done there and would necessarily have to be addressed. You can't look at the offender in a vacuum. You want to look at all those areas and not making assumptions about what needs to happen, but be willing to look and explore those kinds of issues. Sure, absolutely. Good question. When you prepare for an interview, you want to get as much material as you can. I love to get especially information that I'm going to be talking about. It allows me to assess the authenticity of the report. I'll often ask questions that I already have the answers to, just to see the level of cooperation. It's also good to not always necessarily show your hand with this, because sometimes folks will tell you more than what you can get from the reports. People do more than what they get arrested for, we know that. So you want to talk about this in a way that kind of speaks to the whole behavior and not just what the court reports say. I generally try, there's a variety of different ideas for forensic assessment. I'm just talking about a couple of them. Is normalizing the desire to want to look good, and I completely understand that, I'll tell them, but sometimes we have to look bad before we can look good. And if I ask you something you don't want to talk about, you have permission to say, I don't want to talk about it. And I'll respect that, and we can either go back to it or we can deal with it a different way. I prefer that to you making things up. And I talk to them about the difference between not being comfortable sharing things and then making up stories because you're not comfortable with the truth. And then I use my lame little analogy of bringing your car to a garage and not being willing to tell them what's wrong with it. And then they spend all day charging you all kind of money trying to figure out the problem, where if you would have just told them what was wrong, they could have focused more on it. There are times when you have to confront, but you have to do that in a way that we're trying to get to a common place where we can work together, as opposed to a display of contempt. I don't care who you are or how much you value you in relationships. If you feel like the other person doesn't like you or has it in for you or is negatively judging you subjectively, you're not going to do very well in being able to respond to them. We talked about the therapist-client relationship, and then just trying to avoid the interrogation method of using your ACE card, which is that they may be mandated and that you can be a part of more sanctions towards them. They talk about the CIA method of threats and torture as opposed to the FBI method, which they tend to get to know the person they're interrogating more, and they speak to them in terms that they feel like they can relate to more. I definitely think that pathologizing resistance in a setting like this is a big mistake. We expect to see resistance. Resistance is a good thing. Resistance is, I'm a human being, I want to protect a part of who I am, and I'm not going to share this until I've thought it through or it makes sense to me to share it. And so that's part of our challenge, but we can work through that. People who are overly compliant, I see that almost as a higher risk factor than the person who refuses to comply. These are the dynamic risk factors that are predictors of sexual recidivism. Most of the old risk assessment instruments, I'm going to talk a little bit about the categories of them, but a lot of them use static variables because that's what was easiest to archive as far as data collection goes. Static variables being things like age at first offense, number of offenses, prior offenses of non-sexual nature, things that can't change. They're part of their history that they can't do anything about. That makes them static. Dynamic factors are the things that we can do something about in treatment. So these have to do with attitudes, sexual preferences, different kinds of orientations. So they're listed there. You get a chance to see what they are. So as you're doing your assessment, looking at some of them, one of them is deviant sexual interest. Now the first, you don't need me to tell you that you can't say to somebody, so, do you like having sex with kids? Or, is it, sex with somebody you're beating up, is this something you enjoy? Those kinds of things. I mean, that's a lot of face validity, and it's a direct question, but you're not going to get the right kinds of answers. So if we know that deviant sexual interest is part of it, and we've built a little bit of a rapport, and we're kind of at that place in the interview, what are some of the questions you would ask to get this information? And I think that slide should be blank in your handout, because I didn't want to give you the answers, but I'll give them to you after you've thought about it a little bit. But how would you ask about that? And I don't care if it's with children or rape or whatever, how would you ask about a person's sexual interest in ways that speaks to offenses you already know, behaviors you already know about, but at the same time doesn't ask it in a way that's going to get you more resistance or clipped, kind of close-ended answers. Yes?
Sometimes I start with what was their earliest sexual experience. And by starting them very young, they'll often start talking about pornographic material and things like that, and then gradually lead into the more current areas of deviation.
I think that's a great place to start. I mean, a lot of times people want to talk about that because there's a little less culpability, and so it's a little easier to talk about. Okay. What else? Yeah.
Maybe what is important to you in a sexual relationship?
I think that's certainly not a bad question. I think you can certainly get that. You can get that. You may want to kind of frame it in a way that kind of helps them understand what you're trying to get to. Most guys may say, well, if I get a nut off, it was a good relationship, and that may be the end of it. So if you really want to get to the content of the deviant sexual relationship, you may have to be a little more specific in that. Well, let me just throw a couple of them up here. It doesn't always have to be a sexual question. It can be, a question that puts them in realm of that offense without having them to specifically talk about sexual behavior. So what's fun about being with children? You know how adults would generally respond to that. So if this person sounds like they're maybe more connected to the child than an adult would be, that would be a flag for you, and you could, explore that in your assessment. What characteristics do you find physically attractive? If you were going to describe your type, what would that be? And again, you're extrapolating from that. What are some of the things you think about when you masturbate, and what happens in the fantasy? And again, these are oftentimes very socially acceptable answers. This is a consenting person. We're sitting on the couch, we're watching TV, we're holding hands. A very boring fantasy that would not be using masturbation, you know that. So we would want to get more of an idea of what they consider to be an arousing situation. You could even ask them about movies they see that they find particularly arousing. It'll give you some idea of the themes. What objects turn you on is another way that we can get into more paraphilic behaviors. I like the question about, talk about your first sexual experience, and I would even say going with, where did you first learn about sex? I mean, where did you first get introduced to the idea is also a way that they can talk about things that sets a stage without having to give necessarily incriminating kinds of information. Another thing we want to look at is unstable antisocial lifestyle. This is also sometimes difficult to assess. Because oftentimes we associate it with criminal behavior that people aren't generally going to want to talk to you about, or they'll say, well, you have my record, or you have the rap sheet. So how would you get to this information? What are some of the ways you would ask about this to kind of assess antisociality? And there are a lot of right answers. I mean, your style and how you get to it. What would you say? I know, Saturday morning, right? Okay. In what ways are you a rebel? Which ways do you see yourself as unconventional? In what ways are you a risk taker? I mean, we'd like to be seen as risk takers and kind of going against the flow. That's not always looked at negatively, but you can see that. Sometimes you can see antisociality get shared in that context. In what ways do you live in the fast lane? And then kind of the balance question is, how do you feel about people having control over you? The two answers that probably I would be more concerned about is I'm okay with it, and just leave it at that. Or I hate it, I can't stand it when people have control over me. Kind of the socially normed answer would be something along the lines of, well, I guess it depends on the situation, At work, people do have control over me. There are times where other people get to make the decisions. But I also like being able to make decisions for myself. So you want to see kind of where they fall in that continuum. There's attitudes tolerant of sex crimes. Oftentimes these can be quite pronounced. That, say for example, I remember doing an interview with a young person, early 20s, who was doing fine in the interview. Wasn't a lot of flags going up until he got to the firm belief that it was better for him to have sex with a 13-year-old now that he was older, instead of her being groped by some other 14 or 15-year-old who didn't understand what he was doing. And he really believed that an older person should be introducing this younger person to sexual behavior. And the further he went, the bigger hole he was digging for himself, because this was just a risk assessment. I was just trying to get an idea of level of sexual deviance and attitudes towards sex crimes. Those things do tend to come out, even when a person's aware of what social norms are. For example, things about women deserving rape, negative attitudes towards women in general, that there is some responsibility on the part of the victim for the offense that took place. I mean, those are the kinds of things you start to flag as this is a problem. This is going to be a problem. Sexual preoccupation, again, this is a person whose life and kind of their interactions revolve around sexual behaviors, so we would look at these kinds of things in the assessment process. Intimacy deficits, either the lack of healthy partners, intimate partners at an older age, or an emotional identification with children. It doesn't mean a lot of people like kids. It doesn't mean they're sexual with kids. This is more of an emotional identification with children almost on an equal playing field as a partner. General self-regulation problems tend to be hand in hand, because remember, as we're talking about treatment and interventions and ideas and different kinds of things, the generalizability of that, the ability to take this information into their everyday life and not re-offend, is going to rely on their ability to self-regulate in general. So a person may have the right intentions and may have benefited from your teaching. Can they carry it over into their lifestyle outside of that? Employment instability tends to be a big marker for a lot of recidivism research. And it's not necessarily a socioeconomic thing as much as it is, there's a lot of things that go with employment that says a lot, that are observable, measurable pieces about a person's character. You know, ability to follow some structure, ability to work as part of a bigger unit, ability to let other people's needs kind of come before yours as you take care of your responsibilities. So I think that there's a way of measuring connection to authorities that comes from this, more so than whether or not you have a job or not. And then, yes?
Are those risk factors the same for adolescents, or is that exclusive to adults?
No, that's a good question. You're definitely going to want to look at, like, a young person's ability to have an adult-like intimate relationship or those kinds of connections is not going to be as likely. And in most assessments, they won't answer that question, and they'll prorate the score, assessments that actually use that. Same thing with employment. You're going to want to look at school functioning or the other kinds of areas that are similar to that. But that's a really good question. And this is just some treatment planning questions that, you know, I like to look at what their prior experiences have been and what has worked for them. A lot of what I'm looking for is, you know, do they take ownership for their either success or struggles, or is it they didn't fix me enough, they didn't do enough for them? So they externalizing either the benefits or the difficulties they've had in treatment. And then I always try to take into consideration, especially if somebody's done a lot of time in a prison system, that there's a certain thing that the prison system produces that makes a person more difficult to deal with in a kind of a treatment setting. I mean, prison makes good inmates, it doesn't necessarily make good citizens. And when you're treated, and I understand that, this isn't a knock necessarily, but I guess it is a knock in some ways. The whole idea that if you tell somebody what to do every day, if you manage everything they do every day, if you even remove their opportunities to make mistakes every day, and then expect them to kind of have that skill, you know, I think it's really kind of unrealistic. So these are, Hans Toke talks about it in Living in Prisons. And it's an older book, but it's a great book if you get a chance to look at it. And he talks about how surviving in prison can be very counter to learning how to survive in the street. You know, you don't want to be assertive in prison because you're seen as kind of rebellious. And you don't want to trust people in prison because you don't want to be taken advantage of. These are the very same kinds of things that we're trying to encourage them to do. And so I try not to over-pathologize that, but also get them to understand that what worked for you then may not be so good for you now. So let's look at ways of moving past it. I'm just going to say something real quick about risk of violence assessment, and because it speaks to the 4 generations of risk assessment. And I know I'm kind of going through this kind of quick because most of these topics require their own time, but it's good to have some exposure to it, and hopefully the slides are explain enough so when you look back at this you can refer to them. The first generation of risk assessment really was what we generally do in general, which is clinical judgment. You meet with somebody and somebody says, what do you think the risk is? And you draw on what you think is important based on your modus operandi, and you make a decision. And that's generally not been very successful. You know, you're not always the most subjective person when it comes to the person you've been working with. And they've also learned how to respond to you in ways that meet the things you think are important. So it may not necessarily be the most accurate depiction of risk assessment. So what they came up with, the second generation, was let's look at things that are related to people who engaged in this other kinds of behavior, whatever it might be, and see if they match, or to what degree they match with the person you're looking at. And again, these were much more standardized, tended to be more objective, but they tended to label somebody a certain risk level without allowing for that to change, especially if it's based on static variables. If you're a high risk, okay, that you need this kind of intervention, how do we measure if you're changing? If your score is not going to change. You're not going to, the age of first offense isn't going to change, these other things aren't going to change. And so the third generation looked at a more dynamic factors as well, things that we could measure multiple times through the change process to see if their risk is actually changing, and was still looking at restrictions and ways that we can manage this person. And then the fourth generation, which are currently in development, don't just look at those things, but they also look at, and what can we do? What are areas we really should be focusing on to help them reduce that level of risk? So they're much more, I think, therapeutically designed and not just about categorizing people as either high risk, medium risk, or low risk. And that's the kinds of things you want to look at when you're talking to folks about the measurement of risk. If the attribution they're giving to you why this person is not being successful, you want to make sure it's something that they're either addressing in treatment, and it is something that can be modified or changed. Supervision planning is just really, a lot of it's common sense. How well have they done under supervision, and what have their attitudes been? And this isn't just bosses, I'm not talking about bosses here, I'm talking about probation, parole officers, or conditional release people, folks who are working with a person outside of the institution in the community. And then this is some of the other planning that you want to take into consideration. We don't treat people, for example, we don't work with pedophiles so that they can be, you know, one day be in a room alone with a bunch of little kids. That's not the goal of the treatment. The goal is that they recognize risk situations for themselves and avoid those things. So potential access to victims is always something we want to help them regulate and understand the needs of them. Okay? So now we're talking about the actual intervention. And I want to go through this piece because I'd like to end today with an actual group intervention exercise that I think you may find useful in any of the work that you do, especially if you do group work. But the phase model is, for lack of a better terms, I mean, it's just a common sense approach to sex offender treatment. It's what we use at Sand Ridge, and I think a lot of good programs, especially when you're working with a more intense population, use this model. It may not apply to all offenders. I shouldn't say that. It does apply to just about all offenders, just the degrees to which each phase is implemented may vary. For example, phase one doesn't really even focus on the sex offense specifically. It looks at the kinds of things that come with criminal behavior, the kinds of things that might be barriers for this person to be able to get involved in the change process. Defensiveness, distorted beliefs about authority, distorted beliefs about their behavior. Some people don't even need that. They come right into treatment ready to go. I've had guys who've been in phase one for 5 or 6 years before they ever got to phase two. And phase two is when you start talking about your sex offenses. You actually start focusing more on your patterns of offending and the deviant interests. And phase two is probably what a lot of folks think about when they think about sex offender treatment. Now, phase three, you're starting to look at the first two phases in the here and now. So, for example, one of the things you may be doing is, say, for example, they have somebody who's involved in rapes. You may be looking at their current relationships with females in their lives and how are they making connections to some of the choices they make today and how is that relevant to the choices they made in their past. So they're trying to look at how to make these changes in their day-to-day life. And then phase four is the adjustment to the community or to the lower restriction area for them. where they actually do these things, but in a situation that's more like the way that they'll be living their general life. Yes?
Question about timing. Do these treatments generally start as soon as they enter prison, or do they have time where they're in prison and they're not doing treatment?
The general rule, which again falls in that category of things I don't understand, is because of resources, most people don't get to start treatment until they come within peaking distance of their release date. For us, it's average, you start as soon as you consent, because that's why you're there. It's a civil facility. But yeah, a lot of places it's not that way. These are 4 areas that the focus of treatment should be on. And we talked about this in a variety of different ways, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with that. The dose of treatment, and this is what somebody was saying before about the different categories. And if you're going to really create some broad categories for offenders, you talk about the amount of treatment they may need and the intensity of treatment they may need. And that usually focuses around the level of criminality and the level of sexual deviance. The highest intensity, of course, is somebody who's a lot of criminality, high psychopathy, also a lot of sexual deviance. I mean, that's the high intensity intervention. The lower intensity would be somebody who has relatively low levels of sexual deviance, maybe more sexual confusion, social skill ineptness, and also low levels of criminality. And then in between is where the others fall. Then, of course, with sexual deviant interest, you're wanting to know, is it non-consenting? Is it with age inappropriate? Are they acts of abuse? So these are the kinds of things that fall in the category of criminality, right? Consent is important, and the age of the person that's involved. Some statutorily, you want to look at that. I mean, if a guy's 19, he's got a 16-year-old girlfriend, it's a lot different than somebody who's 45 who's got a 15-year-old girlfriend. So statutorily, you want to look at that. You want to look at a lot of other factors, but just generally the categories that you're looking at. And you can see, like we talked about before, I said, folks talk about sex offending being a control issue. Actually, it's because the primary reason people commit sexual assaults is because they either have a sexual deviant arousal or they're not turned off by sexually deviant situations, and they don't do a very good job of managing their behavior. I mean, that's primarily how people end up with sex crimes. For distorted attitudes, of course, you want to assess it, and you want to get the person to kind of see the flaws in their reasoning. So you start to understand the importance, say, for example, of being a certain stage of development to make decisions about sexual behavior. Things of that nature. Self-management problems, you would deal with this in many of your settings, helping people understand how to control themselves in ways that don't get them impulsively into problems. This is the cognitive, the frontal lobe kinds of issues that we're talking about. This is usually a bigger issue, especially with the lower functioning individual, but it is often an issue to some extent for many of our clients. These are some examples of poor self-management. And then responsivity, I talked about it. I think this is one area we don't spend enough time with, but it's, again, trying to address a person in a way that they're more prone to learn. It's important to get somebody motivated. I mean, part of doing this was hopefully to touch on things you think would be important. If I'm talking about things you don't find important, no matter how respectful you want to be, you're not going to be motivated to engage yourself in the training, right? If I'm talking about things that are too jargon-oriented and you're not understanding the terms, again, your motivation, your responsivity is going to be limited. Treatment with individuals is no different. I got to be able to speak to things they value. If empathy isn't important to them, if hurting people isn't necessarily a deterrent to them, then helping them understand how getting your needs met this way is not likely going to produce good results for you, In other words, if you don't like being inside prisons, if you don't like having people tell you what to do, but you do like having sexual behavior and engaging in these things, you got to find ways to get that sexual need met, which is normal and okay to want your sexual need met. But you got to do it in ways you don't end up incarcerated or having people tell you what to do. It doesn't require them to have feelings of remorse. It just has them, it gets them to talk about it in ways. I often tell people I've supervised clinically, you're not trying to make the person citizen of the year. They can end up being obnoxious, egotistical jerk after your best efforts. That's okay. That's not criminal. There's a lot of folks like that. All right? Your goal, and sometimes we don't, I mean, I know that's funny, but a lot of us, we look at our outcome, our treatment outcome, and we want this very grateful, humble person walking out the door. And I used to get in this argument with my treatment director, because he used to sometimes he would use that as a gauge. And I'd say, you know, your pedophiles are very nice, respectful people. They're just sweet guys. Everybody liked them. That's how they kept getting access to the kids. You can't necessarily measure that as a treatment benefit, because they had that already. You know, and the guy who's obnoxious and arguing, you know, he may be battling a change that he's ready to get engaged in. And so I think sometimes we've got to be careful how we quantify some of the factors what we're talking about, we're trying to address in treatment. Sad to say, the group exercise thing that I wanted to do, we're not going to have a chance to do it because we only got 10 minutes. So I'm going to have to skip that. I'll save it for another time. That's your teaser for the next training. But I will talk to you about some other kinds of treatment interventions. An interpersonal therapy technique that I think, especially with offenders, and especially if you're in a setting where you're able to have male and female therapists, so you get to see the way the person relates to males and females, or if they're in a situation in which they're being supervised, any kind of a circumstance that can replicate a real-life scenario, to use event-specific intervention. It is so difficult to, it's not that I'm not trusting of people, it's just that having worked with psychopaths for so long, I don't put them in a situation where they have an opportunity to lie, because it's just too tempting, okay? And so I try to use event-specific situations. So I'm not going to ask them, tell me about the times in your life where you had difficulties with females, and let's talk about it. Because the story I'm going to get might be the real story, or it might be what was on CSI Miami last night, all right? It's not necessarily going to be something I can work with. But if I can get the way that they just talk to my co-therapist, or if I can get the way they talk to the woman on the unit, or the way they handle the situation in which I can verify aspects of it, it's a much more useful intervention. One of the big problems, especially habitual, severely personality disordered offenders have, is an ability to generalize their actual criminal behavior to other aspects of their life. So you have a guy who maybe raped a girl that he was on a date with because who may have been sexual with him consensually had he had more interpersonal skills. But he asks her or does something and she says, you know what, I'm not interested. And he feels slighted and put down and he figures, yeah, well, you're going to get interested, and he rapes her, okay? And then on the unit, you know, years later, you're working with him, and he has a real problem with any feedback he gets from females and female staff because he feels like they're insulting him or putting him down. When they say things like, oh, that's not the same thing, I didn't rape this staff person, or I didn't hit this staff person, you get concerned because there's a very good opportunity to generalize your attitude, the way you interpret information, especially from females, and how it sets you up for reoffending. So that's a big thing, is to try to get folks to be able to see, you don't have to be in the middle of a fight to know that this is a potentially aggressive situation. And so many of the guys, that when I would work with them and I'd say, when did you first realize this was going to go bad? It's almost like the police are kicking the door in and the handcuffs are coming out. It's like, wait a second, when this and this and this and this happened, what were your thoughts at that time? And I tell them it not in a, you know, come on, how stupid can you be way. I tell them it in a, you know, if the snowball's rolling downhill, you're much better, your odds of stopping at the top of the hill is a lot better than halfway down the hill. So let's look at ways of identifying things. The event-specific interventions do a nice job of that. It not only gets more verifiable account, you can get them to role play the situation in a way that helps them do better. One of the things that I really try to do a lot of is when guys didn't do well in treatment group, rather than just address it, I oftentimes, next time they were in group, gave them a chance to do the exact same situation over again. Even if it's just role playing and there isn't a lot of cognitive kind of internalization of it, they get a chance to practice the healthy behavior as well as save face a little bit. And so it's good to use situations, even if it's giving them a chance to role play what they did well. And then you can give them feedback in the situation. You can monitor how they feel through the various stages of whatever they did. And then ways that you can do it is you could have them journal situations. We used to use thinking cards, which is, guys on the unit could kind of report to each group member how they saw things. That didn't always go over real well. People that are averse to snitching, but we tried what we could to sell that. Observation reports are similar. And then, of course, role playing, where especially if you have good people role playing that can actually simulate the actual situation again. And in some cases, you can even have them play the part of the person they were being harsh with. Not necessarily, to develop empathy, but even just to develop a perspective of what that was like. So perspective taking is the other one, and that is, getting them to see things through a different lens. Understanding the thing that I used to always say to them was, it's not always that you make bad choices, it's that the information you use to make that choice really gave you very little opportunity to make a good choice. So you either thought too quick or you didn't look at all your options. I just love this Dick Van Dyke Show clip. There was actually one the other night I just saw on Everybody Loves Raymond. I should try to get that. Where in this one, Rob and Laura, hopefully if you don't know who Dick Van Dyke is, you're probably really young, but Dick Van Dyke Show, they used to sleep in separate beds. That's how old this show is. But Rob and Laura have a fight, and Rob tells his people at the comedy show his version of it, and then they role play it. And then Laura tells Millie, her neighbor, the same story, and they role play her version of it. And you get to see kind of how people's perspectives can really affect what their experience was. And so I talked to them about that if you see somebody coming through that door and you see them as wanting to attack you, you're going to react a certain way. And if you see somebody coming through that door and you see them as an old friend who's bringing you good news, same situation, but it's completely different based on the way that you view them. And there's a lot of exercises you can do around that. And this is the kind of the diagram I showed them, which is, all right, you end up getting in an argument with the staff person. So if we think about all our information that we have about that staff person, some of it's positive, some of it's negative. And then we look at all the information that we actually used when we made our decision. We can see that we've looked at all the things we don't like about the staff person, and there's no wonder you acted in the way that you did. So let's look at why didn't you consider some of these other things. And we talk about it as a filter. So, I just don't like authority. So I forgot that they were nice sometimes. I forgot that they've helped me sometimes. I forgot that they're, doing a job and that they're not really trying to mess with me personally. And I only focused on things like they're trying to embarrass me. They sometimes talk to me in a tone that makes me feel like a little kid, or whatever the case is. And so, again, it's helping them kind of develop some of that. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate and actually have seen in some literature, if they come up with an alternative explanation that's acceptable, don't let it sit there, because that's something they may have prepped for their homework. Ask them for 2 or 3 more, because what you're doing is, it's like doing weightlifting. They're repeatedly using that part of their prefrontal cortex there's been deficits with. It requires executive functioning to do that. And so even if their answers aren't great, getting them to think on their feet about alternatives forces them to gather data, mediate it, and then actually come up with a different situation or solution. We also talk about, you know, the variations between our reality and then what our expectations are. And we talk about the desire to try to make them be more similar, that it's unrealistic to have them be identical. But to try to make them more similar, a lot of our guys use some kind of instrumental emotion or force to have their reality meet their expectations. So we talk about maybe a conflict they have with somebody, and their expectations is that people would always treat them with respect. When reality is that sometimes people don't. And so we tell them that one of the ways you can make things a little more acceptable is to modify your expectations as opposed to trying to forcefully impose your desire on the reality. And then kind of in our last few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about therapist issues. And probably the biggest one I try to talk to students about, and others that are maybe newer in the field, is just about working with folks who can be hostile towards you, even if you're trying to be a helpful person, and having to deal with those kinds of things. This is just one of those aspects that you have to try to recognize your own humanity, but at the same time, don't let this trigger kind of a justified countertransference that I'm not going to treat this person as respectfully as I would other clients because they don't treat me as respectfully. And I often tell folks, your interaction probably does a lot more teaching than what you tell the person. And for a lot of our guys, they're used to either somebody who's weak and overly permissive or somebody who's firm and abusive. And when they can be in contact with somebody who's firm, but also friendly in the way that they deal with them, that experience in and of itself goes a long way in the social learning process. To have somebody set parameters, but at the same time treat them well, treat them as somebody who respects them, that itself can have a major treatment impact on them. In your slides, there's more about different aspects of the difference between working in a forensic setting than maybe in other kinds of settings that I think as a human being you have to pay attention to and not assume because you have training that you're automatically better at working with people who are insulting you than anybody else would do. Those kinds of things affect you, and understanding how they affect you is part of that process. So you've been a great audience, and thanks for coming out today. And